Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, I'm Brian.
And this is the
Bible Bistro. Had to think a minute.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
The afternoon lull. The afternoon lull here.
I could maybe used a little coffee this afternoon.
You could have used maybe a little coffee here, but it's the Bible Bistro podcast.
It is the Bible Bistro.
A podcast about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith.
Pertaining to.
But we are still remote. I'm at Bistro East, you're at Bistro West.
Yeah.
And we are still bistroing, enjoying the fine foods of fellowship.
Yes. Yeah. That was a nice segue there.
That was a very church thing, the fine foods of fellowship. But anyway, we are back. We had a great episode last week. What did we talk about last week, Brian?
You said it was a great episode.
It was a great episode, but now
It was interesting.
What was it?
The title?
Titus. It was about Titus.
Titus. Yeah.
Yes.
My favorite passage.
Your favorite passage. And we had one submission. Kevin,
Yeah.
we
Kevin,
appreciate you.
Thank you for responding to that question.
Yes, Kevin.
Our one listener.
Yes, that's all right. We have more than one, but Kevin's the only one that jumped on the bandwagon. But anyway, we had a great episode last week talking about Titus and a little bit about baptism and some other things. And today, again, back to our bistro roots, being totally schizophrenic, we're going to talk about something different.
Well, you had this idea. I thought it was a good idea. We'll see what happens.
So you encouraged me. You encouraged me a while back to read a book, and now this is not going to be a book review episode. We're not going to talk about a book per se, but kind of some of the concepts that were in it. And the book was called The Transforming Vision, Shaping a Christian Worldview, and it's by Brian Walsh and J. Richard Middleton.
Yeah.
This is an older book.
It's an old book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you can see the cover, you know this is an older book, circa 80s. It's one of those that you get it and you're like, ew, I don't know.
Well,
but it's a good book.
The reason I first became aware of it is I was reading New Testament People of God, and he made reference to Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, in the New Testament People of God made reference back to this book. And in fact, the New Testament People of God is dedicated to Brian Walsh, I believe. And so it's an interesting helps understand some of the background of what's going on in New Testament People of God, I think. So
yeah, so this book, again, I think we've talked about worldview several times on the podcast.
And I should say this just because I keep assuming it, since I've said it once, people remember it. But for me, the New Testament People of God was a really transformative book. It really changed the way that I approach Scripture and think about and study Scripture. And
and that's a book by N.T. Wright.
Yeah.
Well, Brian refers to him as Tom because they're BFFs.
Well, he refers to himself as Tom in his.
But the author, if you're listening on Amazon
N.T. Wright,
or Christian books or whatever, it's N.T. Wright.
He distinguishes between his more academic works and his more popular level works by calling the popular level uses Tom Wright, and the more academic he uses N.T. Wright. So his first name is actually technically Nicholas.
I need to get
Thomas.
a couple different nicknames, for different phases of my life.
You have several nicknames.
Not safe for podcast consumption, but I've got nicknames.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I read this book, and it brought up a couple. Again, it's about forming worldview. Like, what is a Christian worldview? How do we think about this? And it brought up a couple things that I thought I'd like to talk about them, or questions I even had, because I think, not that I was struggling them, but kind of going, I think this could be a hard thing for us to see around. In some ways. So
we talked about world. We have an episode very early in our podcast on the concept of worldview, because I think it's an important one. Yeah, it's definitely an important one.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I just want to kind of set up what he's talking about with worldview. And so he says all worldviews have to answer like 4 essential questions. Like, who am I? Where am I? What's the world that I'm living in? What's wrong with the world that I'm living in? And what is the remedy? Right.
These basic questions. Later, N.T. Wright adds the question, what time is it? Meaning, how do I see where do we understand ourselves to be on the continuum of where we're answering this question? But those last two, now, of course, identity and how do we identify ourselves? Like, for example, we would call ourselves Americans, or, what is wrapped up in that identity? or some people would identify by a political party, and what's wrapped up in that says a lot about our approach and our view of the world. And then you said, where am I? Like, am I in a land of opportunity, or am I in a place where things are difficult? That kind of question. But then those last two, when I would talk about this with students, this idea of what's the problem and how do we answer that problem? What do we think is the solution to that problem is really defining a worldview.
Yeah. I was thinking about this because I was like, the things that I think are other particular worldviews that are out there.
Right.
And I thought that is like a perfect like encapsulation of what they're fighting for, what this other worldview might be fighting for. They're saying like, this is a wrong, and we need to, and here's the remedy, and here's how we write it.
And let me add this just really quick because I want to get some specific examples maybe of this, but here's what's so powerful about worldview. Unless we understand that another person is seeing the world differently because they are coming from this different perspective, it's very difficult for us to even carry on a conversation. From a Christian perspective, the importance of understanding worldview, I think, is so that we can communicate the gospel effectively in language that will be understood by the other person. So Jesus, for example, I think understood worldview when he was approaching those that he was trying to influence, whether they were religious leaders of the day or whether they were the people who were anticipating and waiting for his coming. I think the way that he chose to talk to them and to teach them says a lot about his understanding of worldview. So anyway, that's just kind of a caveat. I'm trying to say this is why, you're always asking, so what? I'm answering the so what question up front. This is why this is important, I think.
Yeah, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the Pharisees saw the Roman oppression as what was wrong. That needed to be overthrown. The Jews needed, the Israelites need to be liberated from that. And Jesus is saying, what's really wrong is sin. Like
it's
that
us, right?
Is us and our own sin. And so it was when they're having these conversations, there was this, while Jesus relates it to them, he's trying to help them see what's wrong is not just Roman occupation, it's them. It's and that only he's the one that can fix it.
Now that would be one example. I was thinking today, this idea of what's the problem. Like if you said to somebody, and we're kind of in this time of really negativity. It seems like if you say, "Hey, how are things going in the world?" In general, but for some people it might be things like the Ukrainian conflict. That may be the major issue that focuses on them. Other people, there's been a lot of conversation about this, would be climate change. They're saying, "Oh, this is a major issue. This is the defining problem of our generation." Or there would be others who would talk about the way the political system in the United States, for example, functions, and that's a major problem. Or the people who are in charge, that's a major problem. And so here's the thing. What you call the major problem then, and then also along with that, what you consider to be the solution for that. Poverty would be another example. Some people would say, "Oh, homelessness and poverty is the defining issue of our age." I didn't mean to get really specific there, but I think this helps us to see, so you can very clearly see people who would answer that question, what is the major problem in the world today, differently, have a hard time coming to conversation with one another, right? And so anyway,
it's just, if you're talking about climate change right now, I keep seeing these people that have like epoxied themselves to the road. You know what I mean? Like in protest.
Really?
Oh yeah, they've epoxied their hand and they've had to chip out the road to get their hand off.
Oh my goodness!
Like it's not good.
Where is this?
It was in England.
Yeah, that sounds. I was gonna guess you.
Seems a very English thing to do.
That sounds like a very English thing to do, is epoxy yourself to the...
painful. I mean, you see these guys trying to chip out their hands because they can't get them off. Anyway, but like if that's the major thing that needs to happen, you've identified the climate as the major problem, and so I've got to be active in that.
And you can shake your head at that and say, "Oh, that's just completely wrong-headed," or whatever. But the difficulty is that being a follower of Christ compels us to engage everyone, right? To engage other people, even those who think differently than we do, with the gospel. That's where this becomes an issue then. We have to learn to communicate in a way that we're able to at least make an attempt. It's not just a matter of yelling at each other. And that's why I think so many times today, conversations can go right by one another because we're not considering the point of view of the other person. Anyway,
so that's worldview. So that's worldview. So I was reading this book, and so it's basically trying to lay out like what is a Christian worldview, like what are the foundational pieces of this. And so one of the things he talked about, and the way he articulated it, and I think this is really important, and I think this, but I've never been able, or I know I think this, but I've never said it like this, but is that we are culture creators as Christians. Like that culture is the task of the Christian, and it's been, or the people of God. I mean, we're all cultural machines in some ways. So that we are living in a culture, but we also are cultural creating things. And so the author looks back, like even at Genesis 2, when Adam was given the job and Eve was given the job to cultivate the garden. And, and to have children and multiply and go out in the world. It's like they're making the case that the job was to go out and shape the world, cultivate the world, create a culture of the world, and that infected everything. And so that culture in and of itself it has to be done in community. Like that culture is communal, it's social, and that culture is not merely like art or music or scholarship, and but that things like the economic things or political life, church, education, technology,
you mentioned agriculture.
Agriculture, all these things, and that to be cultural is like to be human. Like that's like God created us with these things, with the idea of art and beauty and all of these things, and we're supposed to create culture. And so, what does that mean for us as Christians in the world? And I thought that was a really interesting thing to think about is what does it mean for us to be culture creators? Because I think sometimes we can default into a situation where culture is around us and I'm just trying to navigate it, but not necessarily influence culture.
Yeah, I mean, the way you use the term culture creator, and you're not wrong there. I would often talk about that. So it's an aspect of the way that we are created in the image of God, I think. Yeah. Right.
It's rooted in him. Yeah.
He's a creator, right? And so part of the way that we are created his image. Now, we don't create, but I always say we are creative. We take the things that God has made and we manipulate them, or we interact with them in a way that adds our input to it. In a way, it's a partnership, right? It's a divine human partnership in this. So even, I live in a place where things like the genetic modification of crops is a big topic of conversation. This is something that people are engaged in, and they're constantly seeking to improve the amount of yield per acre for corn or for soybeans or whatever. That's a major occupation. So we're taking the thing that God has made, right, and we are manipulating it and working with it in order to have an outcome. And best case scenario in a very positive way, the idea of having advanced yield and having crops that are not susceptible to disease or to various, either too much rain or not enough rain and that kind of thing is ultimately to provide more food for other people. Now, often it does come down to economics, I think, and to become a wealth building tool. In other words, I want to have more. Just like the fool in Jesus' parable, I want to build bigger and bigger barns, right? Rather than focusing upon what's very important there. So
yeah. Anyway. Well, and in that context of talking about culture making machines, our culture creativity, cultural creativity, as you were pointing out. Well, but the acknowledgement of the fall, how did that change?
Yeah.
Culture, obviously culture change, or the fall changed the flow of history,
right?
And culture is a product of history, what has come before, and so there's this that history has been changed, and how has this cultural creativity changed for what we do?
There's, I was mentioning to you earlier, I talk about this a lot with the book of Revelation, because there are several phrases, several times throughout the entire book of Revelation, you have this idea about, for example, many languages, right? Or you have this idea of the wealth of the nations. And one of those places I like to point out is chapter 21. Of course, Revelation 21 is a great passage no matter what. But there's a part of it we don't always pay that much attention to. I think, I turned off my phone. I was using my phone as my Bible, and I turned my phone off. Yeah, go ahead and read Revelation 21, 25 to 27 for us, if you would.
On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no...
It's talking about the age to come, and the New Jerusalem is the way it's described at the beginning. Sorry, just to give you back.
On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it.
Okay, that's what I was wanting, is just that part, and we can read the rest of it here in a minute. But that idea of the glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it is the idea. And so what does that mean, the idea of the glory and the honor of the nations? Is that idea of, the things that the nations has produced, right?
Right.
And so you go back to before the fall, and even really the Tower of Babel is what we're talking about here in chapter 11, where there's a separation of peoples. Mm-hmm. Before that, there's a uniform, I guess we would say uniform culture in a way, right? Mm-hmm. But the confusion of the languages, the people moving into these various people groups, the things that came out of that. Then the amazing thing is to this, and there are other passages I mentioned in Revelation that talk about it. But this idea, that even in the New Jerusalem, then the glory of the nations will be brought into it. Now, I think the glory of the nations will serve to, how do I say this, amplify the New Jerusalem, and I'm going to give you a very practical example in just a minute. But isn't that an interesting thought, that this idea that there are different kinds of culture and different kinds of nations, and their glory is going to be a part of this age to come, of this mm-hmm. new reality that we're hopeful of and looking forward to, anticipating. So,
yeah, this kind of idea was we were talking about the Tower of Babel beforehand. So do you think, I've always kind of wondered, would maybe they would have had the same language, but would have other cultural traditions happened as the earth filled? You know what I mean? Like, I know that's like total conjecture.
Well, but when you think of culture, I think the Tower of Babel is a part of that. I guess I hadn't thought of the question exactly in the way that you said it, but
just like, for example, we are culturally different than the United Kingdom, yet we still speak the same language.
Right. We don't go around gluing our hands to roads or anything.
I'm sure there's someone in the U.S. that's doing that.
But they're culturally. I get what you're saying. That there would be cultural differences. I guess I was thinking in terms of some of the major differences you see are linguistic, like the difference between, the one that comes most readily to me is one that I have experienced, where you have, for example, in Central and South America, you have what is sometimes referred to as Latin culture. This idea of Spanish speaking cultures. Now there's distinction between various Spanish speaking groups as well, but like you're talking about with the UK and I guess you could add Australia to that as well.
Canada.
That's true.
Some of Canada. Kind of.
But I guess I think about just that there are major elements of that culture that seem to be rooted in a difference in language. I don't know. That's an interesting question. What do you think about that?
I was thinking about was the sin of, boy, we're going on down the rabbit trail here. the tower is a unified goal to reach God, or was it about the unity of the homogeny of the culture?
I don't think that was the sin. The concern there is, I think hubris is the sin. It's that we can reach out and become God as ourselves. Basically, it's the same thing that we see in.
They all had the same idea that they could do that.
Right, and the confusion of language is God's initiative. He says, because if they can continue to do this, then quote unquote nothing will be impossible for them, which I don't think is the idea that then they'll be able to do whatever they want, but more that they will rely only upon their own strength rather than recognize their necessity of God. It's interesting to me too that in the very next chapter, we always point this out in chapter 12, then God, this is Genesis 11 is the Tower of Babel. Genesis 12 is God's call of Abram, and it actually connects directly with the genealogy there. But immediately God takes one of those people groups and he says, I'm going to restore creation through this group. I'm going to use this group to be a blessing to all families, all peoples on the face of the earth. So God uses these distinctions and these differences, obviously, for his purpose. So I don't know. That's an interesting question. Here was the other example I was going to use. Living on Hispaniola, this island that is divided into two cultures, right? You have the Haitian culture, which is Creole speaking on the western third of the island, and the Dominican Republic, Haiti on the western third, and then the Dominican Republic on the eastern 2/3, and for a number, there's lots there, but on the same island, right, in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, technically, in that area, you've got two very distinct cultures, and language is part of it, but there's other elements to it as well in terms of practices and those kind of things, and there's an influence and effect upon one on the other, but there's just a very distinct, drawn difference between Haiti and the Dominican Republic in a number of different ways. Some of it's political, which, I mean, you mentioned politics as a part of culture, right? Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, well, it was just musing as we were kind of talking through this, like what did that look like and why?
Sure. The amazing thing to me is, so here was the hands-on example I was going to use, is I have been in context in a couple of different places. Missions conferences is one of them, but I have had the opportunity to worship in a couple of different contexts with people from many different places speaking different languages. And there's something incredibly beautiful about everyone unified in their worship of God with different language and in different manners and different styles. There's something that's just really attractive about that, right? And I don't know if that's just because that's an aspect of my culture, what I'm seeing, but it is an incredible thing, and it leads you to think: is this? There's a doctrine I've talked about. I think we've talked about it on here before, called the blessed fall.
You mentioned it a couple times. Yeah,
and I think we have to be careful. But Thomas Aquinas uses it. He talks about this idea of the blessed fall. Several other great Christian theologians, and the idea is that the base of it for him and for others is because of our sin, this allowed the greatness of God's redemption. Right. The way I think about it is that God is able to take even those things which are intended for evil, like Genesis 50, that's my proof text for this, I suppose, is Joseph's brothers. What you intended for evil, God has used for good. That God's able to take even this brokenness that we have caused because of our sin in the fall, and he's able to make it into something that is incredibly beautiful. And instead of separating us, can connect us in a way, I suppose I would say. But that idea of the nations, the wealth of the nations, or the glory and honor of the nations being taken into the New Jerusalem is an image of that for me.
Yeah, and I think when we think about this, the glory of the nations, they're bringing in different art and culture, but it's all going to be conformed to the worldview of God as the supreme. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, is that kind of where the rubber meets the road? There is that the worldview sometimes is different in those things, and that in the New Jerusalem, worldview is going to be consistent, but there's still going to be cultural expression.
I think so. I think I didn't like your word conformed, but and I'm not saying it's fine. A bad word. I'm thinking you made me think about it. I always say unity does not necessarily mean conformity, right? Uniformity. It can,
but it would be uniformity in worldview perspective.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I agree with that. That it's all going to be consistent with God's nature and purpose. I mean, that there's no question about that. That's not the thing I'm thinking about. But how does that happen? Does it mean certain things? Well, I mean, I think that's true. There would be certain things in culture that would be not in keeping with God's character and nature, right?
It would be expressive of that, of his character and nature.
Or are they transformed like us? You know, we're in rebellion. Is there a way that transformation can take place for culture as well to make it something that is in keeping with his nature? I don't know. That's a good thing to ponder. It's a good thought.
Well, anyway, so the book is called The Transforming Vision, and we're going to get to the main meat of here. What we want to talk about is this idea that we're cultural, that we're participants in creating.
Yeah.
We have, I don't know how you want me to say this. Creativity.
Creator's not a bad. Being a cultural creator is not a bad thing. I was simply pointing out that we're not creating ex nihilo. We're not creating from nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
We're taking what God has given us,
the reality of God, and
right.
Yes, and it's being expressed in the areas of our life. So
you say whatever you want.
No, because then you'll go, well, I don't like that word, and then I'm like,
well, all I'm doing
I'm a big guy, but by the end of the podcast, I'm 6 inches tall and like,
don't take it that way. It's more me thinking through these things and what is it about those words that sometimes I respond to words that aren't necessarily bad. It's just that there's something. I think it helps us explore our thoughts a little bit more, I guess. That's what I'm trying to say.
Messing with you. I never bristle up about anything. Anyway, so with this idea, the whole point of the book was, how do we shape a Christian worldview? So with the idea, he's laying out, this is just a small part of it. He's laying out what is a Christian worldview, and part of that is being participants in cultural creating. And then he's talking about what's the problem. We have the fall is the problem, but also what are philosophical foundations that keep us from living in a true, or things that we might step into, that might keep us from truly fulfilling this mandate of shaping a Christian worldview. And so one of these things is he brought up is dualism. In this book, dualism is one of the major things. And so, if you don't, can you explain it? I mean, I could explain it, or how would you explain it?
There's different kinds of dualism. You're talking about a kind of a mind-body dualism. Is that the main one you want to focus on?
Yeah. So I think that's primarily what he talks about.
Dualism simply means that there are two things that are kind of opposed and are separated and opposed. And the dualism is kind of an either-or kind of way to look at it. And I said there's different kinds. When we say something's black and white, that's a dualism, right? But there's an idea of a mind-body dualism that philosophically sometimes leads us into places, I think is what he's saying, that can be problematic in understanding. So there a really extreme form of this would be the idea that all matter is evil, and therefore only the quote unquote spiritual can be pure. So this idea of a physical body, or then the spirit. This is kind of the separation. Is that?
Yeah. No, that's right. Well, he references Plato, obviously. Platonic dualism, and that there was this idea that the material, the physical, was bad, and that the intellectual, the brain, the spiritual was the good. And so and that was an idea we kind of track that is kind of carried through. So he looks at Augustine, and that Augustine was that the material, again, was temporal, wasn't, and that the eternal or the spiritual was what was important. So the soul finds he says the soul finds its home in the eternal, and the body in the temporal. Knowledge is a matter of the soul. So reasons, like our bodies, our brains, only valid task was to prepare us for faith, and then to help understand our faith. Just thinking about and he kind of tracked through how even some of Augustine's thoughts about sex influenced clergy, clergy celibacy,
Sure.
and so all these things that was of the flesh and not of the spiritual
and I
nature.
think that continues to influence us today. Even in a non-Catholic or a non kind of a whatever your term is for that, where you are like a Protestant or a non-Catholic, non-Roman Catholic, Roman Catholic
a
at
Protestant
least.
or non-Catholic.
I don't know. I'm just saying. I'm saying whatever term you use for that. Well, never mind. That would be a rabbit hole to go down. But I think for us today, I guess is what I'm saying, that there's still kind of this idea that anything connected to sex is bad, whereas God created sex for within particular boundaries and for the marriage relationship, right? But that was a part of Adam and Eve before the fall. Sex was not a part of the fall. It was before the fall. They were given the mandate, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that kind of an idea, and it takes a couple of different forms. There's a couple of Christian heresies even that take this to an extreme, to the point that there's one view that says, well, the God that was creating matter in the Old Testament cannot be the true God because he's dealing with matter, right? Mm-hmm. And so there has to be this other ideal, and again, you see kind of the Platonic, this idea of a higher ideal that is not fleshly or not worked out in this way. So yeah, that kind of an idea. And so then here's where this has affected Christian teaching, the idea that resurrection being an escape from the body or an escape from the physical, rather than resurrection being a physical resurrection, right? Of the
redemption,
body. Redemption of the physical, right?
Right.
And so I understand that what we hope for is a physical resurrection. I think there's aspects of that in Jesus, when he appears and he says to Thomas, touch my, thrust your hand in my side, put your fingers in the nail prints in my hand. When Jesus eats with them, I think all of these are indications of his resurrected body, his resurrected state being a physical, being physical. And that's what we believe. We believe we do believe the true God, right? The real God created the universe. Matter, both the seen and unseen is the way that Paul says it. All things were created by him and through Jesus is kind of the idea.
Yeah. What is the parable of the ones who were taken away and the ones who
the ones who were left? The parable of the woman who was two women were I can't remember.
A threshing now. Or
yeah. Uh-huh. One was taken, the other left. Why? What were you going to go to with that?
So, but in the book, he talks about this this idea of that. The verse preceding talks about, well, God was patient in the time of Noah.
Okay.
That Noah was saved and others from the earth were taken away. Uh-huh. And then the next parable is talking about like the woman who is threshing, and the one, there's two people in a field, one is taken, one stays,
right.
And there's two men and one's taken, one stays. And he asked the question, who gets taken away and who stays? Like who's the believer and who's the non-believer?
Right.
And, culturally, I read that and my first instinct was like, oh, well, the believer gets taken away.
Into heaven.
Right. He gets snatched away from the world. Mm-hmm. And, the author points out very pointedly, actually, if you read it again in the context, in Noah's time, those who were not God's followers were the ones taken away.
Right. And
in this story, the ones who are not God's followers are taken away. Right. Like the believer stays on earth, in flesh, that is still part of the world.
And we do, I believe in this is part of this whole worldview thing. I believe in the redemption of the creation. I believe that the creation, I always said it this way to students, when I was trying to be kind of get the point across is I would say God gets what he wants because he's God, right? So he created the world in a particular way. And when we talk about restoration, the restoration of all things that I mentioned last week, for example, when we talk about that in Acts chapter 3, for example, the restoration of everything, we're talking about something that is being put back into the way that it was intended to be from the beginning. I will sometimes also say all those words are RE words, right? It's resurrection and it's restoration and it's redemption, right? It's an idea of things being put back into the order in which they were previously. Is the other way I'll try to get that across.
Well, yeah, and I think the whole point he was trying to make through all this stuff is that we've created this false dichotomy between spiritual and physical. You know, there's this sense that they're opposed to each other, and you know, his point is like that's a foreign concept of this separation of that, and that in some ways going back to this idea of cultural, that we're part of culture, is that everything is sacred in some point. Like everything can be sacred. And he talks about we create this false sense that what I do at church is one thing and what I do at my work is another thing.
It's a dualism.
It's a dualism. We've created this division between what I do is sacred over here, but what I do is secular over here. It doesn't matter to that. And was trying to reclaim again, like what a Christian worldview is that all things, as if we see ourselves as participants in the cultural development, that all things that we participate in are sacred in some ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I use this quote. I sent it to you earlier, this quote from one of my favorite writers, Wendell Berry. And he's very much about place, right? He farms this little farm in Henry County, Kentucky, and he's very much about staying and being faithful and doing what we're called to do. He wrote one of his most famous poems is called "How to Be a Poet," and there's a couple lines in there that I really like. He says there are no unsacred spaces. Unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. In other words, the sacredness of them have been somehow marred, is the idea. But yeah, if God is a creator of everything as He created it, there are no unsacred spaces. And I think that's the same. The same is true of what you're saying. There's no unsacred time. There's no unsacred relationship. They all have a sacredness to them, and it's trying to recognize this. A couple of good books have been written in the past 10 years or so, maybe I should say 15 now, about noticing the sacredness in the ordinary and the sacredness in the everyday, and that's part of what it means to begin to be transformed into having the mind of Christ, I think, in some ways. So.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of a book that we've talked. I've read, and I think you've read most of it. It's Carl Trueman wrote a book called "The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self," and one of the things he talks about there is he talks about his grandfather and the work that his grandfather did.
Right.
And he talks about, when I think of what's fulfilling for me, like I think about my job, it's got to be a certain thing, like it's got to be fulfilling for me, and it was. And he talks about like his grandfather, if he worked in a steel mill, if you ever asked him if his job was meaningful to him, he would have looked at you strangely because it provided for his family. And so like for me, what kind of triggered that for me is like, how do we think of can we think of what we do as Christians as pleasing to God in whatever context we're in, or we're always looking at, I've been in those conversations before where someone's like, I need to do something more meaningful for the kingdom, or I need to do something more. I need to work in a church, or I need to, travel around the world and do this or something like that. But it's also at the same time going, how are you living your life in this context?
So Paul says, whatever you do, whether in word or deed, talking about actually slave-master relationship, right? Whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it to the glory of God the Father. So we can glorify God in any pursuit, I suppose, if we do it it has more to say about the manner and the intentionality with which we do it, rather than what am I trying to say? Rather than what it is, the content of what we're doing, I suppose.
Well, I think back to the Old Testament with the Israelites.
Right.
They were given a code to live by. It wasn't just a spiritual code. It was how you lived out your life outside of it. It was even about how you cultivated the land, like letting the land rest and, all these things. It wasn't, God wasn't just trying to establish them, and it was there was spiritual practices for sure, but even in that, as he was giving them direction, it was here's how to work out the physical as well. And even though we have fallen and we're not the physical nation of Israel, the mandate is the same, that we are cultural beings. The church is a cultural being.
So another dualism that kind of thing goes along with this is, one we joke about a lot, but the clergy laity, distinction. Where clergy is a different class, or somehow more holy or closer to God or something along those lines. And I think that's led to a number of different problems. There's difference in gifting, certainly, but it's not an issue of having some kind of higher standard or higher place, I think.
Well, it's the what parts of the body, like a complete body. Hand, it serves a different function, but it's part of a whole and participating in that. Yep. So I thought this is a really, I was talking about this with Lauren, my wife. We're talking about some of this stuff, and we're cultural beings, and this, we can fall in this trap of dualism. And then it was the question. I came back to you, and I'm like, well, what about Paul?
I think you're talking about the war of the flesh and spirit in Romans chapter 7, where he says, basically, it is sin at work within me, and I'm at war. That the very things I want to do, I do not do, and that kind of thing.
And so, as we were kind of talking about this, I was like, I think this is a interesting conversation, because I think if you just take this dualism at face value, and then you kind of go, well, Paul talks about a separation between the two of them, or it seems to be making a separate thing, and I think it's also culturally relevant is that we talk about like the unity of my spirit or my mind and the flesh. Are they two separate things? Can they be doing two different things, or are they, how are they connected to each other? So I want to talk a little bit about, what would you say as we think about this and Paul and dualism? I mean, he's living in a Hellenistic society. What does that look like?
Yeah, I don't know. It's I don't want to think he's a dualist. The passage that I thought of for you is one I'll remember years ago when I was in college. I was being taught some of these things we've been talking about by a professor at the time, Mr. Frisney, and what does it mean to what does the age to come look like, and what does it mean to be resurrected bodily, and this kind of thing, and somebody brought up this passage from 1 Corinthians 15, which is the longest teaching on resurrection in the entire Bible. And what is that? What I have, verse 50 here.
Yeah.
What it says essentially, you probably have it there, but it says that flesh and blood will certainly not inherit the kingdom of God, and this, for this guy, that was a big deal. What does that mean, that flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God? What were you going to say?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I declare to you, brothers and sisters, the flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable.
Right. So I think the answer, and I told you when I brought this up earlier, I don't know the answer to this, but I think it has to do something to do with the transformation. Is our focus upon the physical. Paul talks in a couple of different ways about we've had a change of, what do you want to say, perspective, or a change of focus, where we're no longer thinking about just things from an earthly standpoint, but we have a spiritual understanding of them. So there does seem to be that kind of language. Now, I don't want to make him as much of a dualist as what we've been talking about, that is an error, obviously. But I think it may have to do with the fallenness, and Paul talks about this a lot, that we experience the effects of the fall in our flesh, right? And there's a weakness, and it has to be transformed. And that's what the work of Jesus is about. This idea is it's a transformation of our being, so that we are considered right before God, and then we are being transformed into the image of our Savior. We try to take on His, as we focus our eyes on Jesus. That's what Paul's always saying, right? We focus upon Him. It transforms our our desires, and it transforms our actions and those kind of things. That's what I think maybe is going on there. I don't know. It's tough though. Flesh and blood shall never inherit the kingdom of God. It's one of those proof texts, right? That if you don't look at it in too much context, can end up causing some problems with what we're talking about. What do you think? Do you think do you think Paul's a dualist, or do you want to go back to chapter 15 some more?
No, I don't. I don't think he's a dualist. I think I think there is some congruency. I mean, I think for us to, he talks about the flesh as being sinful, you know what I mean? Like being having sin.
Yeah.
And the spirit, but I think even all of us is sinful. And like there's not a part of us, and I think maybe for me, as I've read him and thought about this, is he's talking that the sinful flesh will not inherit the kingdom. Like it's because I think the thing is if my flesh and blood as it is now can, part of the kingdom, I would hope it would be renewed in that.
Just before that, he's talking about Adam, the first Adam, and then saying Christ is kind of the second Adam, and talks about the earthly and that quote unquote heavenly man. And so, I think it might have to do with that. But I understand, again, as I've mentioned before, I understand Jesus to be resurrected physically. I understand the ascension to be a physical ascension of the body of Jesus Christ into the heavens, right? We've talked about that before. I think there's significance in that. And I believe that when we look forward to the resurrection, I don't know what the intermediate state is. We've talked about that before. I don't know what happens to us between the now and the then, but I don't believe we are fully resurrected, or the resurrection is fully complete in us until that day when Christ returns and the dead are raised, right? I
think what's verse 49 here, and just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man.
Right.
Like I think there's a transformative or there's the changing of the flesh, because then we have perishable and imperishable, which we have earthly and heavenly up above. So maybe there's a transformative quality in the nature of the flesh as the kingdom of God.
Right. We've not talked about this, I don't think directly, but we've kind of been hinting around at it. This idea you mentioned, the one left and the other's taken away. And we have this doctrine that is called the rapture, which comes out of I think a misreading of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But it's very interesting. I think there's a detail in it we've often missed that may speak to this as well. So this is 1 Thessalonians 4, starting in verse 13. I'll read. It's pretty familiar to us, I think. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who've fallen asleep, or the new NIV says sleep in death, because that's what he's talking about. He's using sleep as a metaphor, but those who've fallen asleep, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe, and this is the part that I don't think we think about very much, God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. And then this is the part that everybody focuses on. According to the Lord's word, we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who've fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of archangel, with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. after that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds. That idea of caught up together is where that idea of the rapture comes from. But isn't that interesting that God brings with Jesus those who are dead in him? And I always kind of say, is he just taking a ride around the neighborhood with them? Hey guys, you want to see this? We're going to go down and the second coming's going to happen. Let's just go for a ride and then we'll come back here to heaven. No, I think what happens is they are risen first. Their bodies are raised from the dead, and whatever state they were in previously, whatever we understand that to be, was not the complete resurrection. And here's the finishing of that. And they go first, right? Mm-hmm. And really, Paul's primary point here isn't about the order in which the second coming is going to take place and everything that's going to happen. He's really talking about the question, what happens? Because Paul had been so clear that Christ is coming soon. I mean, that was a part of his message. Jesus is coming very soon. And he was so certain of that. I think he made it clear to them to the point they were questioning, well, now people are dying. What happens when somebody's a follower of Jesus and they die? Because there were even in the Jewish circles, there were different understandings of what happens to a person after they die, right? Mm-hmm. If there's any resurrection or not. And so I think Paul's main point here is to say that you don't need to worry about those who fall asleep. In fact, they'll precede us. They will be raised first. So,
all right. There's a lot happening we just dived into there.
Well, I don't know. I don't know why that came to mind. I guess just that whole idea of being raised physically and just that kind of an idea. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that's always. I think kind of talking about the dualism and the spirit's different than the. This kind of this cultural idea that we're all just spirits floating around in heaven with God, right. But that we're embodied, that there is a combination of flesh and spirit in one, and then the new heaven and the new earth is.
We should do one of these podcasts on YouTube, and you're just not there one time, and be like,
I can edit it so I'm there,
and then you disappear.
I'm the one that gets judged. How about you disappear?
I was talking more about the popular understanding of the rapture that you've been taken.
I've been taken. Yeah.
In
Left Behind.
Yeah. What's the bumper sticker? In case of rapture, one of the podcast hosts has been left behind.
Something like that.
Tune in
to see. Well, we've got the calculator. We've got the countdown clock for the next time we record. So,
well, in that case, let's hope it's me, because I don't think I could run this without you.
And I'll just say stupid stuff. So, as you said, we're two halves and we make a whole. Well, Brian, thanks so much for chatting today. I know this is kind of a different one for us to talk through, but this idea of what does it mean to live a Christian worldview?
Yeah.
What is it? What are maybe some of the hindrances to living in what is a true Christian worldview? If you want to buy the book, it's probably an eBay book. I think that's where I got mine.
It's been around for what is it, 70s maybe? Early 80s, maybe early 80s.
It's got the vibes. It's kind of got a early Left Behind vibe to it. Wait, let me see. I'm going to look it up.
I think it's 80 something.
No, wait, no, that's his birthday. 1984.
Okay.
So it's got late great Planet Earth vibes. Anyway, so Brian, thanks so much. And
thank you,
if you're enjoying the podcast, feel free to visit thebiblebistro.com. Up in the right-hand corner, you can click the Patreon button. And if you'd like to support us, you can do so there. Or you can just like us, subscribe to us, give us a review on Apple Podcasts.
Tell some other people about us.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got a question or something like you'd like for us to talk about with more structure than today, feel free to submit that. And
this was good. This is good structure.
Yeah, so. We'll jump into it maybe here in a couple of years. And but the Bible Bistro website, I'm actually working on a revision of it to make it a little bit clearer what's going on. You can get to the episodes a little bit easier, but also we talk a lot about a lot of books and so forth, but you can have like a little option there to see books that might be recommended by Brian or I've read and some stuff like that. You can find some links to resources we like. on there. So that'll be coming out soon. All right, Brian, thanks so much.
All right, see you next time.
See you next Tuesday.
All right,
bye.
Bye.